On the morning of May 10, 1940, France was a fortress. Its army stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, its alliance with Britain unshakable, its generals certain that the next German move would crash harmlessly against the impregnable Maginot Line. By the evening of June 14th, German troops were marching through the heart of Paris. In just 35 days, a nation that had bled and triumphed in the Great War collapsed with a speed that stunned the world. The newspapers called it the strange defeat. The soldiers called it something else, a nightmare. It began with a whisper through the forests of the Ardennes, a place dismissed as impossible for tanks. But by the time French high command understood the truth, the German panzers were already deep in the rear, slicing the country in two. Cities emptied in terror, command posts lost contact, whole armies were trapped before they could even fire a shot. The great French Republic, heir to centuries of military glory, fell almost without a fight, or so the story goes. But what truly happened in those fateful weeks? And how does a superpower vanish almost overnight? The world of 1940 was still haunted by the shadows of the First World War. France had emerged from that earlier conflict bloodied but victorious. The German Empire defeated, its own armies hailed as the shield of civilization. Verdun and the Marne were not just battlefields, they were sacred symbols, proof that French courage could withstand anything. But the cost had been staggering. Nearly 1.4 million French soldiers were dead, entire towns were gone, and a generation had been hollowed out. The survivors swore such horror would never come again. From that vow was born a strategy of permanence, the idea that France would build a wall so strong and alliances so firm that no enemy could breach them. The Maginot Line became the embodiment of that promise. Stretching hundreds of miles along the German border, its underground fortresses, artillery turrets, and steel gates were advertised as unassailable. To its designers, it was not just concrete and gunmetal, it was peace in physical form. If war returned, it would buy the time to mobilize fully and meet the enemy on favorable ground. Yet behind this confidence lurked fragility. France's political landscape in the 1930s was fractured and unstable. Governments fell and rose in months. Left and right clashed bitterly, and the rise of extremist movements across Europe deepened divisions. The memory of 1914-18 made the public wary of aggressive action. Defense, not offense, was the watchword. Meanwhile, Germany was changing at a pace that astonished even its enemies. Adolf Hitler's regime rearmed openly, cast aside the Treaty of Versailles, and fused speed, armor, and air power into a doctrine later named Blitzkrieg. France noted these developments, but interpreted them through the lens of the last war. Tanks were seen as support for infantry, not as independent spearheads. The French army remained formidable on paper, with millions of trained men, hundreds of tanks, and air squadrons at the ready. But it was a force built for a replay of 1914, not for the war that was coming. The alliance with Britain offered reassurance. Both nations promised to stand together if Germany struck, but their coordination was imperfect. Britain's army was smaller and geared toward defense, while France assumed it would carry the main weight of any land battle. In private, British and French leaders sometimes doubted each other's resolve. In public, they projected unity. Across the border, the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, formed a neutral buffer. France believed any German attack would sweep through them, as in 1914. Their plan, known as Plan D, was Sarbe-en-Breton, was to rush the best armies forward into Belgium the moment Germany invaded, establishing a solid front before the fight reached French soil. It was a plan that assumed the enemy would repeat history. And so, as the winter of 1939-40 dragged on after the outbreak of war, the so-called phony war, France waited. Soldiers manned the Maginot bunkers. Civilians carried on under rationing. Air raid drills were practiced, but few bombs fell. Newspapers reassured their readers that the German army was penned in by Allied strength. Yet, in the forests and rail yards of Western Germany, something entirely new was taking shape. A war plan designed not to batter the Maginot Line, but to bypass it entirely. The fate of France would not be decided on the ground it had fortified for 20 years, but in places it believed could never be breached. In May 1940, that assumption would be tested and shattered. Dawn broke pale and cool over the Meuse River. In the little town of Sedan, French Corporal Henri Laval watched the mist curl above the water and cling to the rooftops. His post overlooked a sleepy bend in the river, farmland dotted with poplars, and beyond it, the dark, rolling mass of the Ardennes forest. For weeks the front had been quiet. The war felt distant, a strange, waiting kind of war. Henri's unit manned their position without urgency. They drilled, repaired trenches, shared cigarettes, and talked about the news from home. The Ardennes, they had been told, was too dense, too tangled for tanks. If the Germans came, it would be through Belgium, and the main armies would meet them there. Here, the officer said, there was nothing to fear, yet Henri had begun to not. Ice odd things. The low thrum of engines somewhere beyond the tree line. Distant movement, quick and shadowy, as if the forest itself shifted. Rumors drifted in from reconnaissance patrols, strange German convoys winding through narrow roads, bridges strengthened by fresh planks, trees felled to widen paths. At night, the wind carried a faint, mechanical growl. Some men laughed it off as nerves. Others whispered that the Germans were testing them, trying to spook the line before the real fight began far to the north. Still, on that May morning, Henri couldn't shake the feeling that the river in front of him was not a barrier, but a stage, and the curtain was about to rise. A runner arrived at the command post with a sealed message. The captain read it, frowned, and stuffed it in his pocket. Orders were orders, and for now, nothing changed. The men went back to their routine. But somewhere in the Ardennes, thousands of German soldiers were already on the move. And by the time they emerged from the trees, the calm Henri knew would be gone forever. In the war rooms of the French High Command, the plan for stopping Germany was simple, or so it seemed. Plan D had been drafted in the tense months before war broke out. Its logic followed the pattern of 1914. Germany, seeking to avoid the Maginot Line, would attack through Belgium. France, alongside Britain, would surge forward to meet them, locking the front deep inside Belgian territory before the fight reached French soil. It was a bold, forward-leaning move, and it depended entirely on one assumption, that the main German thrust would come in the north. On May 10, 1940, when German forces invaded Belgium and the Netherlands, that assumption seemed confirmed. The French 1st and 7th Armies, along with the British Expeditionary Force, advanced into Belgium exactly as planned. Politicians and generals congratulated themselves on predicting the enemy's first move. But in Berlin, the real plan, Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, was already unfolding. Conceived in part by General Erich von Manstein, it was nicknamed the Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut. The opening attack in the north was a lure, designed to pull the strongest Allied forces away from the true objective. The hammer blow would fall much farther south, through the supposedly impassable Ardennes. 3 German panzer corps, hundreds of tanks supported by swarms of aircraft, were threading their way through the narrow forest roads, bound for the Meuse River. Once across, they would drive west to the English Channel, slicing behind the Allied armies in Belgium and cutting them off completely. French intelligence had considered such a move possible, but unlikely. The Ardennes was deemed too slow for mechanized forces, too easy to defend. Few units were stationed there, and those that were had older equipment and weaker reserves. While the High Command celebrated its quick move into Belgium, the sickle was already swinging toward France's exposed flank. Publicly, the British and French alliance in 1940 appeared unbreakable. 2 great democracies, bound by shared sacrifice in the First World War, now faced the Nazi threat shoulder to shoulder. Leaders spoke of unity in every communiqué. Newspapers printed images of French generals shaking hands with their British counterparts, smiling for the cameras. Privately, the relationship was more complicated. France expected Britain to commit fully to the Continental War, to deploy the maximum number of troops and chasseurs, equally in the fighting. But Britain, still scarred by the slaughter of 1914-18 and mindful of its global empire, had sent only a relatively small force, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, supported by limited armor and air units. It was a professional, well-trained army, but far too small to match France's massive mobilization. There were also disagreements over strategy. French commanders prioritized holding a continuous front line, fortified and immobile, while the British leaned toward flexible defense and counterattack. In private meetings, tempers sometimes flared. French generals questioned British staying power. British officers quietly doubted France's political stability. The smaller allies, Belgium and the Netherlands, added further strain. Belgium, determined to maintain neutrality until the last possible moment, refused to coordinate fully with France before the German invasion. This meant the French couldn't prepare defensive positions inside Belgian territory in advance, forcing risky rapid deployments when the Germans finally attacked. Still, when the German armies moved on May 10th, the alliance acted in concert, at least on the surface. The BEF advanced alongside the French First Army into Belgium, racing to meet what they believed was the main German thrust. Every day the line held in the north was seen as proof that unity worked. No one at the time realized that both armies were walking into a trap that would soon leave hundreds of thousands of their soldiers stranded with the sea at their backs. On the maps spread across French command tables, the Ardennes looked like nature's fortress. A tangle of steep hills, deep ravines, and thick forest canopy, it had been marked in military manuals as difficult country, terrain that could slow infantry and halt mechanized units altogether. In reality, the French had done little to test this assumption. Reconnaissance flights over the region were rare, and war games seldom considered the Ardennes as a major avenue of attack. Military planners pictured the German army bogged down in traffic jams, easy prey for artillery and airstrikes. The prevailing wisdom held that tanks needed open ground. The forest was for scouts and bicycle troops, not armored spearheads. That belief shaped deployments. The French Ninth Army, assigned to guard the Ardennes sector, was thinly spread and poorly equipped. Many units were reserve formations with older officers and outdated weaponry. Defensive preparations along the Meuse River, the natural barrier beyond the forest, were incomplete. Bridges remained intact, some without demolition charges in place. But in German planning rooms, the Ardennes was not a dead end. It was a highway. Engineers had surveyed the routes, reinforced bridges in secret, and planned traffic flows with meticulous precision. Armored columns were timed to the minute, each regiment slotting into a vast mechanical procession. Luftwaffe squadrons were assigned to shield the movement from Allied air attack. On the ground, the forest itself would aid the Germans. Its cover concealed the columns from aerial reconnaissance. Roads, though narrow, were paved and could carry heavy loads if traffic was controlled. The French assumption that nature would fight on their side was about to prove disastrously wrong. By the time scouts reported the scale of German movement in the Ardennes, the lead panzer divisions were already nearing the Meuse, and the clock was ticking toward the decisive blow. In the spring of 1940, the French public lived in a strange dual reality. On one hand, the war was technically underway. Germany had invaded Poland the previous September. France had mobilized, and troops sat along the front. On the other, the phony war months had passed without major battles on French soil. The absence of visible destruction fed a quiet, dangerous optimism. Newspapers reinforced that mood. Headlines spoke of Allied strength, of the Maginot Line's impregnability, of Germany's inability to break through. Radio broadcasts carried official bulletins describing the French Army as the largest, best-trained force in Europe. Even the German invasions of Denmark and Norway in April were spun as distractions, costly sideshows that proved Hitler's desperation. For civilians, life continued with only modest disruptions, rationing, blackouts, and occasional air raid drills. In cafes, men in uniform mingled with civilians, trading jokes about the Boche and swapping postcards from the front. Few seriously imagined that the front lines could collapse within weeks. This atmosphere was not entirely a fabrication. On paper, France did have formidable resources, millions of soldiers, modern artillery, a strong alliance with Britain. But official optimism papered over deep flaws, outdated tactics, command inflexibility, and poor coordination. Within the army, propaganda served a different purpose. Soldiers were told their positions were secure, that any German advance could be crushed before it gained momentum. To voice doubt was to invite accusations of defeatism. So when, in mid-May, rumors began trickling back from the Meuse about German tanks breaking through impossible terrain, they clashed violently with the image the public had been fed for months. Civilians dismissed them as enemy exaggerations. Officers hesitated to believe them. By the time the truth could no longer be ignored, it was already too late. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. They had slipped behind them. Reports arrive of a sudden German thrust, but from where? What crashed into France in May 1940 was not merely an army, it was a method. The German word Blitzkrieg, lightning war, captured the essence: speed, surprise, and concentrated force. It was not an entirely new invention, but the way the Wehrmacht executed it was unlike anything Europe had seen. Instead of spreading tanks thinly along the front to support infantry, the Germans massed them in spearheads, 3 Panzer Corps driving through narrow points in the line. Behind them, motorized infantry poured in to widen the breach. Overhead, the Luftwaffe struck relentlessly, not just at soldiers, but at bridges, roads, and communication hubs, blinding the enemy's response. At Sedan, German engineers used smoke and artillery to mask river crossings, inflatable boats, and pontoon bridges sliding into the Meuse under fire. Once across, the panzers surged forward, fanning out to create chaos in the French rear. Speed was the weapon. Every hour gained deepened the rupture. Every hesitation by the defenders allowed the wedge to drive further. French forces were stunned by the tempo. Orders issued in the morning were obsolete by evening. Reserve units moved to block roads already overrun. Even the vaunted Maginot Line was powerless once the enemy had bypassed it entirely. Communication breakdowns magnified the disaster. Radio coordination between French units was limited. Many relied on telephone lines the Luftwaffe had already destroyed. German armored columns, by contrast, used radios in every tank, coordinating movements in real time, adapting instantly to changing conditions. To those caught in its path, Blitzkrieg felt less like a battle and more like a sudden collapse of the world around them. The front no longer a line, but a spreading shadow that devoured villages, towns, and roads without pause. And as the Germans poured westward from the Meuse, another front began to crumble, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of civilians. The first refugees appeared as scattered families on bicycles, wobbling down rural lanes with blankets tied to the handlebars. Then came the carts, wooden wheels groaning under heaps of mattresses, clothes, and clucking chickens. By the 3rd day after the Meuse breakthrough, the roads of northern France were rivers of humanity. Entire towns emptied in panic. Rumors outpaced reality. German tanks were only hours away. Paratroopers had landed in the next village. Luftwaffe bombers were already overhead. In truth, some of these places were still miles from the front, but fear moved faster than any army. Cities like Reims and Charleville-Mézières saw their streets choke with cars, trucks, carts, and livestock all tangled together. The retreat had no clear destination, only a way. Families abandoned homes without locking doors, certain they would return in a week or two, just as in 1914. But the pace of 1940's war was different. Many would never see those homes again. The roads became prime targets for the Luftwaffe. Dive bombers screamed down onto the packed columns, scattering people into ditches. Survivors scrambled back to the road, determined to keep moving, even if they didn't know where it led. Military traffic clashed with the exodus. French units trying to reach the front found themselves crawling behind columns of civilians, unable to pass. Commanders begged local authorities to clear the roads, but there was no authority left to enforce order. In Paris, the government watched the refugee tide on newsreels with growing dread. The collapse of civilian morale threatened to mirror and even accelerate the collapse of the front. Somewhere behind the chaos, German tanks rolled steadily forward, not always meeting resistance, because their enemies, both soldiers and civilians, were already gone. In the days after the Ardennes breakthrough, French headquarters struggled to answer a simple question: where is the enemy? The German plan had relied on more than speed. It had relied on misdirection. The initial attacks in the north, into Belgium and the Netherlands, continued to roar with intensity, drawing Allied attention and reinforcements. British and French commanders remained convinced that the decisive battle was still unfolding there. Meanwhile, in the central sector, radio discipline in the panzer divisions was ruthless. Orders were short, coded, and broadcast only when essential. Luftwaffe units, covering the advance, jammed French frequencies and struck at known radio posts. Telephone lines were already in ruins. Scouts sent forward by the French Ninth Army returned late, or not at all. Some French officers guessed at the scale of the disaster forming in the Ardennes, but they lacked hard data to persuade their superiors. German deception helped muddy the picture. Dummy radio chatter in the north mimicked the movements of armored units that, in reality, were racing toward the English Channel. The result was paralysis. By the time accurate reports from Sedan and Dinant reached Paris, they were hours old. Orders to counterattack went out to units that were already outflanked. Reserves sent to block a German column found themselves facing enemy forces to their rear. This fog of war was not accidental. It was engineered, a weapon as potent as any tank gun. The Allies had prepared for an enemy they could track, fix, and fight head-on. Instead, they were fighting a phantom that seemed to strike from nowhere, vanish, and then appear again far behind their lines. And as this phantom cut deep, into France, one place, Sedan, became the fulcrum of the war's fate. On May 13, 1940, the Meuse River at Sedan was a quiet ribbon of water beneath spring skies. By nightfall, it was the hinge on which the fate of France would turn. At dawn, the German 19th Panzer Corps, under General Heinz Guderian, unleashed a bombardment unlike anything the French defenders had faced. Artillery and Stuka dive bombers pounded the riverbank, not just targeting trenches and gun emplacements, but systematically destroying morale. French soldiers cowered in dugouts as the earth trembled. The shriek of the Stukas' sirens, designed to unnerve, became the soundtrack of the battle. Under the cover of smoke and dust, German infantry crossed the Meuse in inflatable boats. The French had expected to destroy any bridgehead quickly, but communication breakdowns and relentless air attacks delayed their counterfire. By midday, German engineers were assembling pontoon bridges. The defenders fought back with courage, but they were thinly spread and lacked reserves. Tank units that might have counterattacked were miles away, committed to the Belgian front. Orders to move them south came too late. By evening, Guderian's tanks were rumbling across the Meuse, fanning out into the French rear. The breakthrough at Sedan was not merely a local collapse. It was the unsealing of a floodgate. Once opened, there would be no stopping the tide. The French High Command still hoped to seal the breach, but the reality was already clear to some on the ground. The front was gone. In its place was a widening gap through which an entire army, and a nation's future, was about to be swallowed. In the chaos after the Meuse breakthrough, French medical units faced an impossible task. Field hospitals had been positioned with the expectation of a slow, grinding war, close enough to treat casualties from artillery duels, but far from the imagined path of a fast-moving armored assault. When the German advance erupted westward, many aid stations suddenly found themselves in the line of fire. Columns of wounded men, some carried on stretchers, others hobbling on makeshift crutches, crowded into small-town hospitals already packed to capacity. Nurses worked without rest, using whatever supplies they could find. Morphine ran short. Blood plasma was rationed drop by drop. Ambulances were scarce, and the refugee-choked roads made movement nearly impossible. Trains that might have carried the wounded away were either destroyed by Luftwaffe bombing or commandeered for military use. Medical staff faced agonizing choices: evacuate a handful of patients and leave the rest, or stay and risk capture. Some units tried to move their charges under fire. Witnesses spoke of convoys of medical trucks strafed by dive bombers, Red Cross markings ignored in the frenzy of attack. In other cases, German armor simply bypassed these pockets, leaving doctors and patients stranded, cut off from any hope of evacuation. For the wounded left behind, surrender was not always immediate safety. Some were treated by German medics, others left to languish until the front passed. For many, the psychological shock was as deep as the physical injury. The realization that the front had moved so quickly, their own army could not protect them. This collapse of medical support was more than a humanitarian tragedy. It was another fracture in the army's ability to fight. Soldiers at the front knew that if they were hurt, rescue might never come, and morale, already battered, eroded even further. The route to Paris lies open, but will the Allies hold anywhere? By mid-May 1940, the French High Command was drowning in reports, none of them good. Maps in the war room were streaked with red arrows racing toward the Channel. Entire armies were in danger of encirclement. The man in charge, General Maurice Gamelin, once revered as the architect of French strategy, now faced growing accusations of paralysis. Gamelin had commanded from a distant headquarters outside Paris, far from the front. His critics claimed he relied on outdated assumptions, waiting for the enemy to commit to a decisive battle rather than reacting to their speed. Orders to redeploy units from Belgium toward the breakthrough sectors were slow and often contradictory. On May 19th, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud made a desperate move. Gamelin was dismissed. His replacement, General Maxime Weygand, was 73 years old. recalled from semi-retirement in Syria. Weygand arrived to find not just a battlefield in crisis, but an entire strategy in ruins. He moved quickly to establish what became known as the Maginot Line, a new defensive front stretching from the Somme to the Ardennes, designed to halt the German drive west. But time was his greatest enemy. The panzer columns were already nearing the coast, threatening to trap the British Expeditionary Force and France's best armies in Belgium. Weygand's arrival injected fresh urgency, but he faced grim mathematics. Building a coherent defense in days, with exhausted troops, shattered communications, and dwindling reserves. The new commander could see plainly that the war might soon hinge not on victory, but on survival. In the north, the Germans were closing the jaws of their trap. The question now was not whether France could stop them, but whether any of the Allied armies could escape at all. War is not fought on courage alone. It runs on fuel, food, and the constant flow of supplies, all of which were beginning to fail France in the last weeks of May 1940. The rapid German advance had severed key rail lines and road networks that fed the French armies. Fuel depots were overrun or abandoned. Armored units that might have counterattacked simply ran out of petrol, their tanks left idle in fields or on roadsides as crews joined the infantry on foot. Supply trucks, forced to navigate the same congested roads as retreating civilians, often never reached their destinations. Food shortages struck both the army and the civilian population. Refugee movements stripped countryside markets bare, and cities far from the front began to feel the pinch. Soldiers on the Maginot Line often fought on half rations, while commanders scrambled to source provisions from regions still untouched by the invasion. Ammunition was another crisis. French artillery units reported shells arriving in the wrong calibers, or not at all. In some cases, frontline guns fell silent, not because they were destroyed, but because their crews had nothing left to fire. The Luftwaffe's relentless bombing deepened the crisis. Warehouses, bridges, and fuel convoys were prime targets. Each destroyed depot was more than a lost stockpile. It was a blow to the will to fight. For the civilian population, scarcity bred fear. Long bread lines, empty shelves, and sudden price spikes eroded the belief that the government could protect them. Rumors spread quickly that Paris would be abandoned, that supplies were being reserved for the army, that surrender was only days away. This breakdown of the economic lifeline was more than a symptom of defeat. It was a cause. Without the fuel to move, the food to eat, or the ammunition to fire, even the bravest army could not hold. And yet, in the north, hundreds of sands of Allied soldiers were still fighting, and in danger of being trapped forever. In the early weeks of the invasion, official statements still clung to optimism. Government bulletins spoke of local setbacks and flexible withdrawals, language meant to reassure. Radio announcers reminded listeners of France's resilience in 1914, when the German advance had been stopped at the Marne. But by late May 1940, the tone on the ground had shifted. Soldiers returning from the front told a different story, of German tanks appearing where none were expected, of units cut off without orders, of towns changing hands twice in a single day. Refugees poured into every village, bringing tales of bombed columns and shattered defenses. In cafes and bread lines, conversations turned hushed. People glanced over their shoulders before speaking. The word défaite, defeat, was no longer unthinkable, only unspoken in public. Some newspapers began printing cautious critiques of the high command, hinting at mistakes without naming them outright. Others, still loyal to the government's line, accused such reports of undermining morale. In the army, whispers spread even faster. Men asked whether their leaders truly understood the situation or whether they were being sacrificed to a hopeless fight. The knowledge that the Germans had bypassed the Maginot Line, the very symbol of national security, was a shock from which confidence never fully recovered. Propaganda now struggled against lived experience. A soldier who had seen his unit decimated, or a family who had fled 2 homes in a week, could not be persuaded by slogans alone. The fracture in morale was not total collapse, yet. But the belief that France could rally for a decisive victory was fading fast, replaced by a quiet, corrosive question. How much longer can we hold? The answer might come sooner than anyone wanted, at a port city whose name would soon be etched into history. By the 3rd week of May 1940, the German Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut, had closed behind the Allied armies in Belgium. Hundreds of thousands of British, French, and Belgian troops now found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket along the Channel coast. Dunkirk was not a natural fortress. It was a port city surrounded by low, marshy ground, with limited roads in and out. Under German pressure, the pocket was collapsing from the south and east, while the Luftwaffe pounded the evacuation routes. Faced with the prospect of losing its entire professional army, Britain made a fateful decision: Operation Dynamo, the mass evacuation of troops across the Channel. The French government agreed, reluctantly, knowing that every British soldier saved would preserve the alliance, but also fearing that French forces might be left behind. Diplomacy in these desperate days was fraught. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud pleaded with Winston Churchill for more Royal Air Force support over Dunkirk, while also pressing for continued British participation on the French front after the evacuation. Churchill promised solidarity, but was equally determined to preserve Britain's own survival. On the beaches, Allied soldiers formed long, ragged lines waiting for rescue under constant air attack. Naval ships and an improvised flotilla of fishing boats, ferries, and private craft shuttled back and forth, pulling men from the sand. The British evacuated the bulk of their force, but tens of thousands of French soldiers were also brought home, some to fight again in the coming weeks. The evacuation was a logistical miracle, but it came at a terrible cost: heavy losses in men and equipment, and the strategic abandonment of northern France. What remained of the French front would have to face the German advance without its strongest units. And the Germans, having paused briefly at Dunkirk, were already preparing for their next blow, toward the heart of France itself. The Maginot Line was meant to be France's last real chance at halting the German advance. Stretching from the Somme in the west to the Aisne in the east, it was hastily assembled in late May 1940, using whatever troops could be withdrawn from the north after Dunkirk, along with reserve formations and garrison units pulled from quieter sectors. On the maps in Maginot's headquarters, the line looked solid, a continuous barrier across the approaches to Paris. But in reality, it was a patchwork. Many sectors lacked heavy artillery. Some positions were manned by exhausted soldiers fresh from retreat, their numbers depleted and morale fragile. Communications between sectors were thin, and reserves were almost non-existent. The Germans struck on June 5th. The assault began with a massive aerial bombardment and artillery barrage, followed by concentrated panzer attacks on weak points in the line. In some areas, the French held, briefly. Units fought stubbornly in hedgerows and village streets, buying hours at the cost of entire battalions. But the German method was relentless: punch through, bypass strong points, and drive deep into the rear before defenders could regroup. By June 7th, multiple breaches had opened. German armor poured south, enveloping pockets of resistance. Entire regiments found themselves surrounded without warning. On the ground, the collapse was visible on every road. Columns of retreating soldiers, guns abandoned in ditches, villages left smoldering. On the maps, the neat defensive line disintegrated into scattered, disconnected fragments. Paris now lay exposed. Weygand and the government faced a grim choice: defend the capital street by street and risk its destruction, or declare it an open city to spare it from bombardment. The decision would shape not only the battle for France, but the image of its fall. Paris stands undefended. What choice will remain? South of Paris, along the Loire River, the retreating French army tried to draw a final line. Bridges became lifelines, and potential death traps. Every crossing point was guarded by small detachments of soldiers, engineers ready to blow the spans if German armor appeared on the horizon. In the town of Saumur, a handful of cadets from the cavalry school took up positions. They were barely out of their teens, trained for parade ground discipline rather than desperate defense. Yet here, in June 1940, they faced the most seasoned army in Europe. The Loire's banks were quiet under summer heat, but tension coiled in every shadow. Across the river, dust clouds marked the approach of German advance guards. The cadets dug in behind hastily built barricades, mounting machine guns scavenged from abandoned depots. Ammunition was scarce. Each man counted his cartridges like gold. When the Germans probed the defenses, the cadets fought with a ferocity that belied their inexperience. For 2 days, they held the crossings against tanks, artillery, and infantry assaults. The river ran with debris. Shattered boats, fragments of bridges, even livestock swept downstream in the chaos. But the fight could not last. Orders came to withdraw before the position was encircled. The cadets slipped away under darkness, leaving behind the town they had sworn to defend. Their stand did not alter the course of the war. The German advance was unstoppable now. But in those 2 days, the Loire was more than a river. It was a final symbol of resistance, an echo of the courage that still flickered, even as the nation's defenses crumbled. The enemy's next step would not be resisted at all, for the gates of France's heart were about to be opened. On the morning of June 14, 1940, Paris awoke to the sound of boots. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées in perfect formation. The swastika unfurled over the Arc de Triomphe. There were no barricades, no artillery duels, no street fighting. The French government had declared Paris an open city to spare it from destruction, and the army had withdrawn the night before. For Parisians, the change was both sudden and surreal. Just days earlier, officials had promised the capital would be defended. Now, the streets were lined with German soldiers, their vehicles parked beside shuttered cafes. Posters in German appeared on walls, announcing curfews and regulations. Loudspeakers broadcast martial music and the clipped orders of the occupation authorities. Some citizens stayed indoors, curtains drawn, unwilling to witness the humiliation. Others emerged cautiously, either out of curiosity or necessity, their steps slowed by the sight of an enemy who now strolled where French police had stood. A few tried to go about business as usual. Bread still needed to be bought, water fetched, children fed, but the city's pulse was different now, measured to the rhythm of the occupiers' march. Fear mingled with uncertainty. Would the Germans treat the city harshly? Would arrests begin immediately? Rumors whispered through neighborhoods. Collaborators spotted speaking with officers. Resistance leaflets already circulating, ration cards to be introduced. The city's landmarks, Notre Dame, the Louvre, the bridges over the Seine, stood unchanged. Yet Paris itself had been transformed into something unrecognizable, a capital under foreign rule for the first time in 70 years. The occupation had begun without a battle. Ending it would require years of struggle, sacrifice, and blood, a reality still unimaginable to many who watched the conquerors pass that June morning. As German columns spread across France, the government itself was already on the move. First to Tours, then to Bordeaux, ministers fled south in a scramble to maintain some semblance of authority. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud fought to continue the war, urging that France's colonies and fleet could carry on the struggle from North Africa. But his cabinet was divided, and the will to resist fractured under the weight of disaster. On June 16th, Reynaud resigned. His replacement, Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun in the First World War, saw no path forward but to seek an armistice. For millions of French citizens, the announcement the next day was a shock. Some wept. Others felt only numb relief that the bombing and fighting might finally end. Not everyone accepted the decision. In London, a little-known brigadier named Charles de Gaulle broadcast an appeal over the BBC, calling on French soldiers and citizens to continue the fight wherever they could. His words reached few at first, but they planted the seeds of Free France, a movement that would grow slowly, fed by exile, defiance, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. For those who fled with the government, exile was often as bitter as occupation. Officials, diplomats, and soldiers who escaped to Britain or North Africa left behind families, homes, and a homeland under the swastika. Many carried the weight of guilt. Had they abandoned France, or were they preserving its hope? The memory of June 1940 would divide France for decades. Was it a necessary surrender to save lives, or a betrayal of the Republic's ideals? In the heat of that summer, no one knew how long the shadow of occupation would last, only that the nation they had known was gone. And soon, the world would learn the price of surrender. When French envoys arrived at the forest of Compiègne on June 21, 1940, they were met with a deliberate gesture of humiliation. Adolf Hitler had ordered the meeting to take place in the same railway carriage where, in November 1918, Germany had signed the armistice ending the First World War. This time, the roles were reversed, and Hitler intended every detail to remind France of its defeat. The terms were severe. France would be divided into two zones, the northern and western regions, including Paris under direct German occupation, and the so-called Free Zone in the south. administered from Vichy under Marshal Pétain's government. The French army would be drastically reduced in size, its modern equipment surrendered. The navy would be disarmed, but not handed over, a concession that left Britain uneasy about whether it might fall into German hands later. Perhaps most galling was the requirement that France bear the cost of the occupation, hundreds of millions of francs each day, effectively funding its own subjugation. For Hitler, the arrangement was as much psychological warfare as political settlement. Allowing a nominal French government to exist in Vichy gave the appearance of autonomy, but in reality it fragmented resistance and legitimized collaboration. French negotiators could do little but sign. They lacked both the military strength to refuse and the political unity to continue fighting from abroad. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated the armistice as one of his greatest triumphs. In France, the news was met with a mixture of grief, resignation, and quiet rage. The ink had barely dried when the next phase of the occupation began: arrests, censorship, and the reshaping of public life under German control. And as the shock of surrender settled, the human toll of the campaign began to emerge. When the fighting stopped in June 1940, the silence was heavy with absence. Families waited for word from fathers, sons, and brothers who had marched away in the spring and never returned. Some would learn their loved ones were dead. Others would be told they were prisoners of war, bound for camps deep inside Germany. The casualty lists were staggering. In just 6 weeks, France had suffered over 90,000 dead and more than 200,000 wounded. Hospitals in both occupied and unoccupied zones were overwhelmed, their wards filled with shattered bodies and minds. Doctors faced shortages of basic medicines, surgical tools, and even bandages. Many worked in makeshift facilities, schools, barns, and abandoned factories converted into treatment centers. The trauma was not only physical. Soldiers who had survived the retreat spoke in broken phrases of relentless air attacks, of comrades left behind, of the moment they realized the front no longer existed. Civilians carried their own scars, the loss of homes, the memory of bombings, the faces of strangers they had met only in flight. Psychological wounds were harder to count. For some, the sudden collapse of France's armies felt like the tearing away of identity itself. The republic they had believed unshakable had fallen in barely a month. In its place was a daily reality of curfews, ration shortages, and the presence of foreign soldiers in the streets. In the weeks after the armistice, the official focus turned to rebuilding what could be salvaged. But beneath the surface, grief simmered. For many, mourning was private, even hidden, out of fear that open bitterness might draw the occupiers' attention. The campaign was over, but its wounds, both visible and invisible, would shape France for years. Was France truly defeated, or was the fight only moving elsewhere? The fall of France in 1940 was more than a military defeat. It was a national trauma, a shattering of the belief that a great power, prepared and allied, could not be brought to its knees in a matter of weeks. For decades, historians have debated the reasons for the collapse. Some point to outdated doctrine, an army built to refight the First World War, rather than meet the mobile warfare of the Second. Others blame political paralysis, a leadership divided, reluctant to make hard decisions until the crisis was already irreversible. Intelligence failures, overconfidence in the Maginot Line, and the underestimation of German speed all played their part. Yet to view 1940 only as a story of failure is to miss its other legacy, resistance. While the armistice ended organized fighting in France, it did not end the war for the French people. In London, Charles de Gaulle's call to continue the struggle began as a faint echo, but grew into a rallying cry. Across occupied France, small cells of men and women, students, farmers, factory workers, risked arrest, torture, and execution to pass intelligence, sabotage supply lines, and aid Allied escapees. For the Allies, the fall was a brutal lesson. Britain now stood alone in Western Europe, facing the possibility of invasion. The United States, still neutral, took note of how quickly even a major power could be overrun. The campaign underscored that in modern war, speed, communication, and adaptability could outweigh sheer numbers and fixed defenses. The France that emerged from the war in 1904 would be changed forever. Liberation brought pride, but also painful questions about collaboration, about the choices made in 1940, about the meaning of patriotism under occupation. These debates still echo in French memory today. And yet, the image that endures is not solely of defeat. It is also of return. In August 1904, 4 years after German troops had paraded through Paris, French forces, alongside the Allies, marched once more down the Champs-Élysées, the tricolor flying high. Crowds wept, cheered, and sang, not only for the liberation of a city, but for the restoration of a spirit that had never truly died. The fall of France was sudden, but its recovery was long. Its legacy lies in both the warning it offers and the resilience it proved. In the summer of 1940, France was a nation in shadow. Yet, even in shadow, the light waited to return.